Serious, ex-prisoners of Reddit. Who was the most evil person there, and what did they do that was so bad? Not sure about most evil but interesting story. When I did time I was bunked up with a guy who had stabbed his uncle to death, molested him. Guy was insanely mean, but when lockup came, he was super nice to me. He was 23 but couldn't read or write, so we would dictate letters to his girlfriend and I would write them for him. When my dad went to jail he was shocked by how many young men couldn't read or write. He made a lot of important friends because he was one of the few people able to help with legal paperwork. When I was in the outbox the day before I was released, I was hanging out with a bunch of guys just killing time. One of them was part of a Muti killing gang. They kidnapped and killed a bunch of people for body parts and cut them off while the people were alive. It was a pretty gruesome case. Anyways, he was really quiet and rather stupid. Just a simple farm boy type. There was a correctional officer at least 6'5" and well built, and he would always come in pissed off. So one morning we are waiting in line for breakfast and he thought he heard this older man call him a bitch. He followed the man back to his cell and started teeing off on him. The man didn't even try fighting back, and when he fell the first time he split his head open on the steel bunk. The inmate was so out of it he started asking where his car keys and wallet went while he was on the ground bleeding. The correctional officer hears the man and for some reason turns around and goes back and hits him a few more times and says, "Who's the bitch now?" I'll never forget thinking, damn, this is somebody's father. I was in Judicial District Court, not Department of Corrections, but most of the people in Judicial District Court were locked up for the same reason as some people would be in Department of Corrections. I remember talking to this kid and he was kind of stupid in the head. I asked him what he did and he raped his 10-year-old sister while she was asleep. Most of them were in there for murder, but he stood out since he was a sex offender. I worked with a lot of juvenile sex offenders over the years. Normally the best behaved out of the bunch, and when I would happen upon their convictions it would always surprise me at how heinous some of their sex crimes were compared to how subdued and or polite they were when I knew them. The sad fact is that the overwhelming majority were in there for perpetrating the same abuse that they were simultaneously a victim to as well. Sad to see the circle of abuse and how it perpetuates itself. Same. I was a detention officer for a while, and I never looked too much into what the kids did, especially if they were well behaved. There was this one kid that was just great. Always helpful, and never caused problems. One night in the control room I mentioned to a coworker how awesome this kid was helping close up the kitchen, and she says, "Have you seen what he's in for?" I had not. So she showed me that he was actually in for molesting his 18-month-old baby sister. I'm a juvenile corrections officer and absolutely agree. The best behaved are always sex offenders. The worst are usually car thieves. This rich kid stabbed his friend in the chest, killing him. But he was on Xanax and weed at the time and doesn't remember anything of it other than his friend on the floor dying. The mad thing is this guy, 18 years old, actually got off with the murder and found not guilty, although was sent down for just under 2 years for possession of a knife. His parents were quite wealthy and it was a big case in the UK. Basically his barristers were the best money could buy and he said that's how he got off. Edit. He didn't have any remorse for his actions, which was made to think made him a pretty crap up person. It's a funny one though because he actually seemed a nice guy until he would talk about the killing and just didn't care what he had done. Nobody else in the prison had ever killed anyone to my knowledge, as it was a lower cat prison, but he was only there for possession of a knife. English guy here. I spent 4.5 months in prison in 2018. There was a guy who was really nice, seemed like a genuine guy. That was until I found out he strangled his drunk wife to death and left her there whilst he went to work the next morning. The killing your wife and going to work like nothing is wrong thing. Years ago, husband trained a guy in his company and the guy forgot their assigned iPad one day. He told him to go home and get it. The guy went home, stepped over his wife's dead body in the kitchen to grab his iPad and returned back to work. About a week later my husband came home and told me what they had found out when the police came in to ask them timeline questions and more right before he was arrested. He killed her before work, was hoping that his alibi would be I was at work all day on base. I couldn't have done it. He made some critical mistakes. He would have been caught either way, but proof that he went home when her body was already laying there dead was another nail in the coffin for him. I'm 20, was in and out juvie from 15 to 18 till I went to county jail. The worst people I came into contact was a boy 15 who shot his stepmother, slit her throat, beat her head in with a blunt object, wrapped her in sheets for the father's roommates to find her, then he shot him. Happened in McMinnville, Oregon. Other than that, a lot of people raping siblings and making threats to shoot up the high schools in the area. That's Yamhill County for you. Before I got my prison sentence in 2013, I was in Arapahoe County Jail with James Holmes. Was pretty crazy cause they'd put the whole facility on lockdown to move him, even though he was in segregation. 12 life sentences plus an additional 3,318 years for that guy. Deserves it. I was a CO and we had an inmate like that. We didn't do a full lockdown, but every inmate had to be in their housing unit anytime we moved him. Couldn't have any other prisoners with any shot at getting to him. He was accused of beating a 3-year-old to death. None of the guards were thrilled, but it was our job to protect him and we did. Then when he was at the courthouse for a hearing, their dumbest security failed. Some other prisoners got to him and almost killed him before they were stopped. They could have killed him easily if they hadn't dragged it out to make him suffer. At his trial he was found not guilty. My mom was in prison for 12 years. She knew a girl in federal in Phoenix, Arizona who had decapitated her husband, kept his head in a cooler in the boot of her car, and then proceeded to take a road trip with their 4 kids with his head in the back. I was in a women's prison. New inmates told everyone she was in for tax fraud. Couple of days later, she gets the crap beaten out of her and doesn't leave her cell again. Food gets taken in by screws, and eventually she gets ghosted out. Turns out she was in our side and both her husband and son were in the male side for running a child porn ring. Those guys had been put straight in the VP wing, but most female prisons don't have enough sex offenders to have one. It was one of the screws who told some of the inmates why she was in. They wanted her to be taught a lesson. The offenses were awful. She was fully part of it and was responsible for acquiring a lot of the victims as she was trusted by people. Youngest victim was her niece's 3-month-old who had to be hospitalized due to trauma. I worked as a parole officer for a while. Some sex offenders are beyond help. Some are truly evil. Example, one guy kept his 9-year-old daughter in his basement, no other family, and raped her repeatedly while torturing her, including force feeding her until she threw up and then forced the throw up down her throat. After court and did his prison time, yeah, he got less than 8 years for this. He would bitch often about how the system was out to get him and it wasn't fair. He is a pose who should have got life. When I was in jail, my cellie was a guy that tied his old lady down to their table and tried to carve "do not resuscitate" into her chest. Halfway through the cops showed up because the neighbors could hear her screaming. I tried as politely as I could to tell the captain that I don't mess around with woman beaters and asked for a block transfer. Thankfully they put me in work release, which was awesome because I got to work in the kitchen and deliver food to the different blocks. No food hall meals were brought to you and you never left your block except to go to the basketball CT or the library. Well, one day I'm serving food to one of the solitary cells and as soon as the slot is opened, a drenching wet magazine gets thrown out. Turns out it's covered in piss and the woman inside is the shit my previous cellie carved up. Turns out she stabbed her son with a syringe of her blood and she was inside too. Some crazy stories all around, but that couple far and away were the craziest people I saw. Hands down. So this lady was married, husband cheated, had a full-blown affair, ended up with a love child. Somewhere along the line the wife is babysitting the husband's illegitimate child. He comes home from work, sitting down to eat dinner and asks her, "How is the baby?" She says, "I don't know, you tell me." This bitch ended up killing the baby, cooking it, putting it in the food and fed it to him. She's doing 2 life sentences. This is in Arizona, by the way. Side note, she looks like the devil. Her eyes are literally black and she looks like she has no soul. It takes a lot to creep me out, but this lady's vibe is def one of the darkest things I've ever felt in my entire life. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video. so all your dreams can come true.